Welcome everyone to our Monday.com Inspect and Reflect session. Let's introduce our speakers. We have Derek, Gonzalo, and Gabriela. Derek, would you like to go first?
Hey everybody, I'm Derek Onai, Senior Product Designer focused on design systems over at Rocket Money, based in the Midwest. Excited to have a nice conversation looking at Monday's Vibe design system today.
Hi everyone, I'm Gonzalo. I'm a Chilean product designer based in Ireland. I'm a senior product designer in the CDST, Zalando Design System, in the Zalando company. Very happy to be here and share with all of you.
Hi, I'm Gabriela Shufi, or Gabby for short. Over the past 7 years, I've been working as a product designer. I'm currently based in Dubai, in the Middle East, and working with design systems for the past 3-4 years.
And you all know me. I'm Farid. I'm going to host the session today. So the goal of this session is to inspect and reflect on how Monday.com Vibe design system is being used within the Monday.com products. They have a couple of them, like Monday CRM, Monday Work Management, and Monday Tasks. The goal is to see how their components are being used within the product. So we could learn some interesting practices and dive deeper into how they document their components. We found some interesting highlights there as well, how they expanded the functionality of Storybook by having it as a more like, not just like tool for engineers, but like a proper documentation tool that with like custom sections as do's and don'ts. So it will be interesting to dive into that. And join the community if you would like to see our upcoming Inspect and Reflect sessions. You can join our Slack channel in order to get all the updates and the recording from the session. By the way, the Figma board will be available even after the session, so please make sure to register to the event so you will get all the materials afterwards. The reason why we started this thing is with this design system inventory workshop. The core idea here is to not start with components, but start with products and understand what they have. That will be a source for us to define the design system components. A quick highlight of that is just you are taking specific product like Pinterest and you start cutting things into templates, components, elements to see how things are organized and how product teams are currently solving specific problems by using specific component sets. That will help you understand how product teams are using your components, and also it will help product teams to understand how design systems, how they group things, how they name things, and what kind of variations of the components there might be. So we have already done some inspect part. As you can see, here are all the main screenshots of Monday.com. They have Monday product, Monday.com tasks, dev, Monday work management, Monday CRM, and profile administration. All the screenshots are available here. If you see some interesting components that we're talking about, and you see some interesting variations of that, feel free just to duplicate the screenshot and crop it so that if we're talking about cards, for example, or tiles, you could crop it and put it into our board, into our section where we are talking about specific things, right? So that will help us to see how those components are actually being used. So let's start with diving deeper into their documentation, right? So everything that they have is done within Storybook, and this is like our first highlight. Anyone who wants to give their first thoughts on the ways how Vibe design system is documented? Derek, would you like to give your
Just
impressions?
looking for my unmute button. Classic. No, I think from the highest level, with a welcome screen like this, it's really important to direct people to the information they need. If you didn't include this initial page, where should I start is probably the first question for someone coming in with something like Storybook being used by engineers, designers, and product folks. The organization sets the tone. Even if you scroll down a little, they have the meet the team and the contributors, which shows how broad this is. You may have a core team of design systems, but with Monday.com, seems like a lot more than just that core team is contributing to the system, which is the end goal, right?
Love it. By the way, this is something new for me personally. This kind of approach to publicly recognize people who are actively contributing and making changes. So this is something interesting. Yeah, that's true. And another thing, what was surprising for us is the catalog that they have. They are not actually showing the screenshots, they are showing the actual components. In the preview of every component family here, you can actually interact with it. There are some cases when things like the model windows are put as a screenshot, but like the way how they did the previews is also fascinating. Gonzalo, do you have any like first impressions on the vibe design system?
Yeah, I think similar to what Derek was saying, I wasn't expecting like the detailed amount of documentation that you can find in this website. I'm usually not a big fan of documentation storybook for many reasons, but I think this one works very well. And one of the things that caught my attention is that they have a migration guide, which we do have something similar, but I think this is very, I guess, generic, but also there's very specific examples on how to migrate to some things. I think that's very useful. I think there's always migration happening on design system, in my opinion. There's always something being deprecated. There's a new version or whatever. So it's nice to have guidance from the design system team in this manner.
Gonzalo, you mentioned that you do not prefer using Storybook for documenting design systems. What is your go-to?
So we use Figma for designers, we use Storybook for web, and our engineers use some other tools with Markdown. There's a kind of historic kind of issue with that because there were 3 different teams, then they were getting together. But at one point, start merging all the documentation in a single place is very hard, especially when you're dealing with different platforms because formats and such. The thing about Storybook is that you're going to expect an engineer doing the documentation. Some designers might feel a bit threat using Storybook, or even GitHub sometimes, like tools like that are kind of hard for some designers. So that will be one of the reasons. Actually, internally, we're working on a unified documentation project, which aims to kind of bring all these different pieces of documentation in a single place. And we're still using Storybook to kind of bring documentation from Album Web. We're migrating documentation to make this happen. But most of the time that I see in some Storybook documentation, they are not that fancy. There's always something missing, or they seem very technical. So for some designers, it might be hard sometimes to engage with that kind of documentation.
Gabriel, do you have any first impressions? Maybe you like something about the vibe design system documentation so far, or you see some interesting opportunities to improve?
I agree with Gonzalo that it's very hard for design systems to have a centralized documentation. Sometimes designer has to go to a specific tool, engineers go to another one. But each component that you open on Vibe Design System, they do have information for developers, the props, how to use it. At the same time, they have the usage guideline for designers. And you would expect for something with so many informations to be a very long documentation, but they found a way of simplifying how they write the usage and everything. So the way that they merged both documentations for designers and engineers in one platform is very nice.
Derek, you have some thoughts here?
I didn't catch this when I was exploring earlier, but the contribution guide, there's probably a lot more that goes into it, but even just to get started, if they are providing this to all of their customers and want to source and allow others to contribute, I just think something like this guide, which is one of the main pages in their navigation, is just helpful as a start to make sure that, if people are submitting pull requests to their system, they have some guardrails or guidelines that, really helps everyone at the end of the day, help us, because if anything goes in here that benefits everyone using Monday, that's, it adds to that list of the people, that have contributed at the beginning. So, help them help you make their product better.
That's true. Great. So let's dive deeper into actual places where they have the components. I already imported everything into the Chrome extension. Let's see what kind of component families we were able to find. So let's start with models, right? There are a couple places where models are being used. The first one is add new workplace model. If we click here, that's where we can see some of those components being used. Before diving into that, let's dive deeper into the documentation. They have 3 different models. First of all, they have the previous one as deprecated. I was able to find a lot of basic models, and the pattern looks similar. We have a header, we have a close button, and we have some footer with some action buttons at the top, at the bottom right corner. But talking about the media model and side-by-side model, I couldn't find them much, maybe because there are some new, and maybe they are mostly used on the marketing website, not on the product itself. Speaking about the basic model, let's take a look into documentation so that people will be familiar with things that are available here. So as you can see here, there are so many props for the model itself, for the layout, header, content, footer, and also other parts. And they have different sizes. They have different types as alert models. They have an option to show the content that is scrollable. Some of the use cases and examples here, you can actually expand the footer with this wizard model. You can have it as confirmation model. You can add more things into the footer. My design background tells me why the checkbox is not aligned to the content, but that's okay. And you can also add more menu items in. Let's dive deeper. By the way, I love how they have these related components. It was so easy to see if I'm actually taking a look into the right component family or the wrong one, because you can quickly scan it and see everything in one place. Okay, let me pull things that we were able to find into our board. And we can start chatting about what kind of things do we see here, and maybe some interesting observations. As you can see, not all of them are using the right component from the design system. Any first impressions at this point?
Yeah, I think something that's really interesting and it's in the documentation is, whereas these are all modals, in their Storybook site, they still have documentation for their deprecated component. Looking between these first 2 modals, the add new workspace and invite to this board, the alignment of the title and even the font, you can see are actually different between the 2. So what that may say to me is like this first modal may actually be using the deprecated component, but it's really important. I'm actually going to pull over. I'm sure what they were experiencing is inside of the code. The left here is the deprecated modal, and you can see the structure of the content a lot less flexible, or maybe more flexible, right? You can do anything inside this content area. You can provide a title in the actual modal component tag, the new modal, as they maybe had new needs arise where, we want media in it or we want split. They've actually abstracted a lot of this into sub or nested components. And I think that's what we're actually seeing then in the product, and why we might have some of these inconsistencies. And it's always tough to deprecate things in a design system. If you just delete something and someone isn't aware of what to use next, you're actually going to be spending a lot more time trying to solve that problem than announcing it's deprecated, which they do very well in Storybook, slowly working towards removing old instances or migrating them to the new component before you can actually remove it from the code base. Modals exist in a lot of places in Monday, but it is really nice that they've provided what is maybe that older deprecated component alongside the new one, and additional documentation on the new one and why people should move towards it is really helpful.
Love it. So speaking about the deprecation approach, right? Any thoughts on how it's executed? They added some labels here as well. Like maybe you have some interesting learnings on how you went through this transition period with some of the components that you deprecated, and what was your experience, maybe some interesting practices that worked out in Figma. Gabrielle, do you have any thoughts on the deprecation process?
Deprecating a component is still a process that can be improved on Figma. What we did is we created a custom plugin but because we migrated from an old library to a completely new library, so we had to deprecate like 20 components. We created a plugin that basically applied an overlay on the component. So the component like had a red overlay on it and changed the name of the component for Deprecated. So whenever you're using this component on your designs, then once we deprecated it, it would show like as red. So we're kind of forcing people to change for a new one, at least in the design part. But it's still a very manual process because people would have to go on their files and change from the deprecated component to the new one. But it was an easy way we found to show them that this is the old one. Don't use it. It's deprecated.
Wow, that's interesting. So like having a custom plugin could facilitate this kind of transition period, right? And help people.
Yeah, that's what we did for Figma. I work mainly with design, but it was very helpful, especially when we had to migrate from one library to a whole new one, and there were many components being deprecated.
Love it. I remember a long time ago there was some interesting practices on changing the parent frame background so that when you're searching and the previews of components are being generated within Figma, you could see if the background is red, for example. That means you need to put some attention into that, right? So, and also renaming that with adding like a dot into the name, it will hide this component from releasing, right? Maybe do we have some interesting practices on how to do deprecation within Figma?
I don't think they created a feature specifically for that. Because if a component is already published and then you add a dot to the beginning of the name, people who are still using it, it will still be there in the layout. But we just needed a way to show them that this is not the latest version of a specific component, that they should migrate to the new library. It's the same idea as you said, like changing a background of the component, but when we had the plugin, it just applied an overlay. It's like a similar idea. So it was very easy to identify.
I like overlay because it's more visual, right? You can see immediately on the page.
Yeah.
Derek or Gonzalo, please mute yourself and start adding things.
I just wanted to add that we do something similar in Figma. Like I think everyone does something similar, to be honest. Like kind of add a background, an overlay or something, change with an emoji saying something like dangerous, deprecated component, red thing here. Something like that in Figma, I think it works. But then again, what Gabriela was saying is designers do not update the library. They will never get the update saying that this was deprecated. So you will still gonna be using that thing. I think it's especially problematic in Figma because designers, most of the time, they will copy paste stuff from one place to the other. And then you don't even care about updating stuff and you would never know that this was deprecated. So one of the things that we put a lot of effort was in communication, like how to announce, like, hey, pay attention to this. This is an old component. We had a new component. Start migrating things. If you need help, reach out to our public chat and stuff like that. I think that's the main tool to do a successful migration. All the technical tools that you can have, I think, are helpful, but if you don't give the human support to the consumers of your design system, it's going to be really hard for them to understand, first, why was deprecated, and second, what are the benefits to migrating to put all this effort on migrating to this new component, for example.
And I always had this interesting question related to breaking changes, right? Do you have some kind of guideline or checklist where you are explaining what is the breaking changes within Figma components. Because if some people are using your components as a part of their prototype and they are doing some usability testing, we can say please do not update before releasing or doing anything. But when there are breaking changes, are you creating a new component set and deprecating others, or just updating the current one and just like communicating? Like, so where is this like red line when we actually, it will be better to create a new component instead of updating the old one?
I can say from recent experience, we were updating a bunch of components, mostly to support dynamic text for accessibility. That we introduced 200% size for text, so you can mimic how it would look when a user uses a bigger font, for example. That meant that a lot of components were not going to work because some components were not using auto layout, for example. So when you increase the size, all things will break. So a rule of thumb, I would say for us, is that if it is breaking our own experience, like making the variables again, you need to do so many changes. That point out, we might need to create a different component and deprecate the current one instead of just saying, hey, this is a big update. But the other thing you were saying, following what I was mentioning, one thing we took from our engineering team is they are very good at announcing these breaking changes, this log of changes. We didn't have that at one point, like versioning, for example. We didn't have that. We introduced that a year ago. Now, every time we get a new full version, we create a document where we put screenshots about what will happen if you update this, for example, and what are the actual breaking changes. Like be aware of this is going to happen. This might break your compositions, especially if you don't have auto layout set up on your designs. But then again, if you deprecate stuff and you don't mention it to anyone, that's a big headache for all the users.
Yeah, we do everything within our power to not create a breaking change in an existing component, but that may mean introducing a new variant where things are fixed within the same component before we get to the step of creating a brand new component altogether. And so you try all of these little levers first, because, if you go into your analytics in any system, and I'm sure Monday deals with this as well, they probably have a single component that's being used over 10,000 instances. Introducing a breaking change is catastrophic to someone's workflow. As soon as they update your library, consider using a new variant, or like Gonzalo mentioned, sometimes there are cases where we do need to create a new component and then communicate the migration plan or assist and help teams that may have more instances, or maybe create a cutoff date announcing early this will be deprecated in the next major version. Consider already using the new component, and maybe through other meetings or design reviews or crit, depending on where and how your teams are set up, you may have the ability to say, hey, it looks like you're using this older version. We have this new component or a new variant that fixes a lot of these issues. And consider using those to not need to destroy your workflow.
Love it. And we have a question from the community.
I was checking the same thing. One thing that we did some time ago, we used to have inverted versions of components in order to support color schemes. So we used to have like a black link and a white link, black button and an inverted button. Once we fully migrated to design tokens, I was very happy to start removing all of those things. We did that in Figma and in code at the same time. We kept those things for a while, maybe 6 months, because we needed to give support to people that were using those stuff anyway. But I wouldn't know if there's a time frame that you can set up in advance. I think it depends on the case, what the things that you're deprecating. In this case, the thing that we were doing is that we were adding a new feature, which was that you don't need to, for designer, for example, with variables, you don't need now to do the work for light mode and dark mode. You can just use the variables. One thing is the benefit of migrating. Why go through this headache? Also, when you remove stuff, people will ask, what do I use now? So you always need to have an answer for that, because you can't say, no, you can't use that anymore. People are going to say, okay, now I have an empty space. What do I do there? So you always need to have some answer for that to support them.
Gabriel, do you want to share your story?
We never completely removed the component. The old library still exists, but we set on the Figma configurations that the new rebranded system is the default one. We never completely remove the old one.
Got it. Great. So let's go back to the model windows, right? We can see that the ones coming from the design system, this is coming from the newer version of the model window. We can see the header is similar, the X button is a little bit smaller, but they also have this additional icon button close to the X button as they had in the guidelines, right? But those are the things that are coming from deprecated or maybe old version of that. So, and maybe in some cases they wanted to change the header and have this title bigger. Any thoughts on those components that we see in actual use?
I have one thing I was noticing here, the model content can be customized according to user needs. For a company as big as Monday.com, this is really important because they have many different products. And sometimes aligning with all these different products, all their needs, it's very hard. So sometimes having a slot or allowing custom content is very important. So you keep the core of the component, let's say the title with the X button or the footer of the component consistent across all the variant. But then in the middle, you allow each squad, each team of your company to customize the content. And I think this is very nice.
Love it. For the template, so you can see that the model window is completely different, right? The header is centered. The template model window is like almost like goes full size. If you see those kind of things within your products, right? What are your next steps? Do you do the assessment of the usage of this new variation that specific product team implemented? Are you waiting for green light from product managers to understand that this pattern works great? We see metrics are going up, so it's a proper valid solution to this specific user problem. And only then you're adding that to your design system. Let's imagine we're working on Monday.com. We see this kind of template model window being used a lot. What will be your next steps after that? Would you consider adding to the design system? What kind of criteria would you set up?
I think this is one of the cases that you kind of try to keep it very agnostic, as Gabriela was saying, like, because basically the content can be anything. If you go the other route, you start creating a bunch of variants, a bunch of props to support everything. And it's a good idea in the beginning, but when you need to actually support that from a human perspective, it's very painful. So I think there's in-between state that is hard to hit, but it depends on the product you're doing. For example, Zalando will say that this is more of a pattern rather than a component. So I will say, this is a form, but this is a form on a dialog. Sometimes there are things that we're just going to keep outside of the system because they cannot be absorbed by the system, or they are only being used in a single place, for example, or only in a couple of single places that are outside of the reach of the design system. Not every case needs to be part of the system, I would say, but some things are useful sometimes just to consider these as patterns. Like one way to use dialogues is this, one way to use a model is this.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. There are times, and it's a great opportunity to let others help you explore and find new patterns or new variants for existing components. You know, what you can do in design systems, similar to what Gabby mentioned, like if you're going to introduce this new pattern, how it opens and closes should maybe remain consistent. Where an individual goes to close it should maybe remain consistent to all of the other modal experiences, like the close icon in the upper right-hand corner. What the buttons look like inside of this experience should be consistent. We don't necessarily need to build it for you because you may be testing out if this is a new experience to your product. So template may have been a much smaller, what we'll call a traditional modal in their design system. Maybe this is an experiment to provide a much larger canvas for, X number of reasons. And so, keeping a pulse on these variations can help you grow your own system. So if this works really well for templates, there may be another team that wants to try it out and they try it out and it also works. And then maybe that actually gives you the critical mass to say, hey, let's pull this into the system so that now we can get some of those engineering and design efficiencies so that the team doesn't have to build this custom every single time.
Love it. So the key highlights here is that we need to keep components agnostic. So people could expand, but keeping the same patterns, keeping the same rules as how to close the model window, what kind of things could be added inside the model window should be as a foundation, right? That people are going to build on top of that. And it's a good practice to explore how people are expanding the possibilities of your components so that maybe in some cases you will rethink the ways how your components are being used and add more variations in the future. The criteria to add it to the design system is based on the usage. Is it used in one place of the product or multiple parts of the product? How many teams are using it? I guess the breaking point might be if there are like 2 or 3 teams using it and they are not communicating with each other. So that's the story of how multiple parallels of these components might grow because there is no consistent connecting point within the design system. Taking a look into how many teams are actually using it might be another interesting point. And the third one, to check if the current implementation is successful on the production, meaning that it actually solves user problems, there are good metrics, etc. So that could be added to the design system. And Gonzalo, you mentioned about the patterns. How do you envision that? So let's dive deeper into the basic model, right? Would you create completely separate sections here to create it, to name it as patterns, and then link it to the model component and say like, here are, for example, the variations of the component, but here are also the patterns of the component where people are expanding the usage of this specific model window. How do you envision that? Like, how do you expand component documentation into the patterns?
I would say that usually a pattern is a composition of more than one component. So it's you choose mention like which component are being used in order to build this pattern. But patterns sometimes are guidance and examples. Follow this pattern, but in order to follow that pattern, you actually build that thing. It's not like a component where you can reuse a component, choose the variant and play with the props. A pattern is more of a guidance, like good practices on how to use this component for a different context. I was thinking in this case, we have a form, and I think like a form, it's usually a pattern. It's hard to see like this is a form component, like what does that mean? So it's usually going to be a pattern. And for that, on a form, you will start saying, for example, always have a heading, provide error messages, and all those are guidance, but it's good to have those as examples, like real examples from the product, so people can actually see how that works.
Got it. So as a quick recap, is adding a new section here called examples, where people could actually see in specific areas those model components being used. And also, like we spoke about last time, sometimes showing not only where your components are being used, but what kind of custom solutions product teams created that the design system team plans to refactor into the design system. For example, if there are invite to this board a specific component on this page, we will highlight that this is not a part of the design system as an example, but we are planning to change it in the future, maybe in the next quarter, maybe expanding it with some insights from the design system folks, saying why exactly this invite to this board component should be changed into the design system, because maybe they are breaking some rules, guidelines, right? So that might be an interesting point. Great. Let's dive into any final thoughts on the model windows before we jump into...
One thing that I noticed that's very problematic for designers are the sizes of models, because you can have like 3 different sizes, small, medium, large. Then you can also have responsiveness of the type of component. In Figma, what do you do? Design only on one breakpoint? Do you duplicate this, switch to the other breakpoint? And then do you use a smaller dialog, or do you adjust the dialog? I see they're already not in that, because I think it's a common issue In Figma, when you start thinking about sizes and responsiveness, how do I know that this is the right one and not just an adjusted size manually?
Yeah, maybe using less strict sizing and min and max ranges inside of them can help you and help people with responsiveness, because just because your window size is pixels wide, should small stay 300 or should it be flexible to move up to that 500 range depending on the size of the screen? Yeah, I mean, sizes are definitely.
Yeah. The other thing is when do you use one? Like you have these 3 examples. The 3 of them look kind of okay. Like why would you use one instead of the other? It's just a designer criteria, product criteria, content.
I think that would vary from product to product. On a model case could be breakpoints on more complex components. Sometimes we would have 2, one for mobile, one for web, and in case it changes a lot from one version to another. But yeah.
Do you define some kind of guidelines on the frames that people are using for the screens, like 1140 pixels for desktop, another 720 for tablet devices? Do you do some, because what I'm thinking is if there will be some consistent way of how frames are being generated, screens are being generated in Figma, we can snapshot one specific state of this adaptive responsive design for the model window. And we could say that for the desktop, the medium size is always this specific, 600 pixels or something. Derek, you also shared some interesting thought about min and max values.
Yeah, I just think, you nailed it with that question. Should the size of the modal be dictated by the size of the window, or should it be the content that decides? There's still limits based on your screen size. And like it is the classic design system or really design answer of it, it depends on the context, it depends on the content, and it depends on the experience. And so it's maybe a area where you don't want to be too prescriptive, but ensure that your team is aware that there are different options and maybe some just don't work, but you have flexibility with others.
I agree 100%.
Great. Let's dive into others. So the other component is called attention box. After going into the product and seeing where attention box is actually being used, it's pretty consistent. I couldn't find any interesting opportunity areas where the attention box could be replaced or it's being used as a custom component. I feel like for the attention box, it's actually being used from the design system.
This is an interesting one because I was going through their documentation and they have 2, one called alert banner and another one called alert box. I think the examples that you pulled in are actually from an alert banner because they have a CTA. They have a different color, the way that they draw more attention. But they created 2 similar components, which is kind of tricky to identify.
It's true.
I think this is one of these components that you always get questions like, should I use this? What's the difference? The name? The alert banner attention box makes sense to me. I know these are called differently, but I think there are some conventions like toast or notification, whatever you want to call it. But any of those for me will be more common than alert banner. Is it a banner? Attention box. Hard to know how to use this only because of the name. And as Gabriela was saying, they look pretty similar in a way.
Yeah, from what I understand, the alert banner goes full bleed and then the alert box is contained within a box. But I would say it's probably a component that we get a lot of questions.
Yeah. And they also have a toast component, which adds a bit more flavor to the conversation.
In our design system, we have quite a few messaging components as well. And we were trying to develop some kind of a decision tree of when you use each of them to make the decision for the designers easier.
Can I ask how good that works? How does that work in reality? In a decision tree for those cases?
So we have a set of questions. What is the message being used for? Is it a critical message? Is it an informative message? So then it would guide you to the right component or variant.
Yeah, Derek, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so we spoke about the decision trees. One of the examples that people were referring to is Decathlon decision tree for using specific component families. So, and also other teams, they created Figma prototype where you can actually select answers and it will tell you what kind of component family you need to use. I know that it takes a lot of time and maybe we don't need to start from scratch and we can just take some of those decision trees from others.
Yeah, I think the interesting bit here, and it's in the description, is attention boxes within content areas. And that seems to be, or like as close to the information and the content that it's referencing. So to me, that's the decision of when to use this. This may be so specific that if the information's at the top of the page, someone may actually use an alert banner instead. And so I think it's an opportunity. You know, we're getting a lot of questions on attention box. Can that be abstracted to a component that is more flexible? So we don't need to support 3 components, and that's a documentation. It might be easier for a consumer of the system to just say, hey, we're using, I don't know, I'm going to call it generically an alert. And it can be used in all of these different ways. The content itself is very similar depending on what you're trying to do. It does seem like the reason this exists is for those within moments. And if I got asked this question, that would probably be the piece that I always send someone back to or ask someone to help them through a decision is like, where does this live? Because that may dictate what actually should be used. What is a content area?
I was just thinking that sometimes documentation helps, but the more documentation you add, you start adding concepts that can be weird or new for people. I would say to my team that there's always going to be someone that is its first day using this stuff. And for me, if I see this in my first day, I will ask, okay, what is a content area? And someone's will have to explain to me what is that for me to understand how to use this stuff. We had an internal conversation recently about token naming. Someone was saying, okay, this token is going to be called container something. And I was asking, what is a container? So like blurry the definition of a container. If you ask 10 different designers, they will tell you 10 different things, engineers also. I think sometimes we think it's clear that you can understand, oh, this is a container. It contains things. But what is a container? Like, how does it look? And I think it's similar to stuff like content area. Like, what is that? Who wouldn't know?
That's true. And also, by taking a look into the code snapshot, we can see the success attention box coming from the admin permissions page. Looks like it's coming from the design system because they have this attention box within the class names. We spoke about that in our previous inspector sessions. The way how to improve this specific naming is also add abbreviation of your design system, like Vibe Design System, VDS, into the name as attention box. So that will help you to understand if this component is actually coming from your design system. It's more applicable for larger enterprise organizations where you have like multiple design systems being used at the same time. We spoke about that during our Microsoft Inspect and Reflect, where they had like 3 different design systems used within the same page. If we look into this user management attention box within the admin page, we can see that looks like they created it custom. And actually, if we will compare visually with the design system, looks like this is something custom, right? Because the icon sizes are different and the text is a little bit different everywhere. That's an opportunity to replace this custom component with the actual component from the design system. It will bring more accessible components and save time on maintaining different variations.
Yeah,
Please.
It's like why there's some things that are rounded, the other one is square-ish. Like I guess it's not just a visual theme, but it's also where they're used, maybe. I don't know. Like, I don't know if there are many things that are square or rounded. What would be the right one in this case?
I guess it's all rounded. It's just that the background is dark, so that's why it's hard to see within the screenshot. But it's round. Great. Let's dive into other component families. Let me just pull everything else that we were able to find. within Monday.com. Here are all the other components that we were able to find as badge, box components, a lot of buttons, and some of them we found opportunities to replace with the actual design system components. You can check how other components are being used within the Monday.com website. If you will go into the community board, and by using this specific extension, you can see where specific components are being used. You can quickly locate them to see where they are used within the specific page. In some cases, as we discussed, you will be able to show examples of how your components are being used within the products, or examples of custom-built components from the product teams that you are planning to refactor or improve, update in the future. So thank you very much for joining the session. We will share the recording and FigJam board. Feel free to join the Slack community if you would like to talk about the naming conventions and how to tag components properly. So thank you very much, everyone who joined. Thank you, Derek, Gonzalo, and Gabriela, to sharing your thoughts. I will make some quick highlights of this long format video, and we'll share that on LinkedIn so that people could be inspired and excited about like some interesting things that we discussed about, like decision tree, how to deprecate components. And today's session was more about Figma related stuff. Any final thoughts on the Vibe design system?
Yeah, I mean, I just think at a high level, I love that it's public. I love that they're trying to let people help them improve it. Design systems is, you're always in your own land focusing on problems, building efficiencies for others. And I think they're doing a great job of bringing people into that world when they can.
Yeah, definitely. They have all the contributors there on the front page. I think they're putting a lot of effort to make not only people from inside but outside to contribute to the design system. So it's very nice.
Yep, same. I think the documentation website, it's top notch. Like they have a lot of examples, a lot of things that you can learn from. I will always say to send some love to the people behind the design system. You guys are doing a great job. Keep doing it. Keep going.
I love it. Thank you very much for joining the session. I will see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, guys. Bye-bye.